Raining, and that shit will help you solve the case.
Ah! Oh, the frogs falling from the sky.
There aren't many filmmakers with a filmography as varied as Paul Thomas Anderson. From gambling to the porn industry in the 70s and 80s to a large-scale canvas of hyperlink cinema centering around a game show, to a peculiar Adam Sandler rom-com, to oil-rich California at the turn of the 20th century, to an indirect exploration of the rise of Scientology, 70s hippie culture and youth culture in the 70s too, as well as a film set around 50s high-class London fashion, you'd be hard-pushed to name a director that has explored so many aspects of culture in as many different time periods as PTA has. Right from the beginning throughout his filmography, there's usually two characters in his films that come into each other's lives in some way or another that kicks off the film's narrative, which usually revolves around those characters' dynamics. In Hard Eight, that's Sydney and John. In Punch Drunk Love, that's Barry and Lena. Boogie Nights, that's porn filmmaker Jack meeting waiter Eddie. And in Phantom Thread, that's Reynolds and Alma, and so on throughout his filmography. Films like Boogie Nights and The Master have these grand scale stories, but the films are still at their core about two people. What I want to talk about today is my two favourite films of his, and those being his 1999 mosaic hyperlink drama Magnolia that weaves together multiple lives and stories, and his adaptation of Thomas Pynchon's novel Inherent Vice, where a hippie private detective gets caught up in a convoluted investigation whilst trying to find his missing ex-girlfriend. These two films are at complete opposite ends of PTA's stylistic and narrative spectrum, the former being his third narrative feature and the latter being his third most recent feature. Magnolia kind of broke PTA free from these Martin Scorsese mimics, and whilst Hard Eight is good and Boogie Nights is incredible, they don't shy away from the inspiration from Scorsese's works, and Magnolia is truly where he came into his own as a filmmaker. But Inherent Vice could also not be more different from Magnolia. You see, Paul Thomas Anderson after Magnolia took a complete left turn in his work with Punch Drunk Love, and since then has been quite unpredictable. Magnolia, to me, represents the best of his early work with that youthful but still slightly more matured from Boogie Nights filmmaking charm, whilst Inherent Vice is perhaps, although his funniest and loosest film, also one of his more maturely constructed ones. Magnolia is perhaps his tightest written work, as its 3-hour runtime is packed full of characters and different stories folding out simultaneously, where watching it you can feel how meticulously planned out every shot is. Whilst Inherent Vice is his loosest work, where PTA is playing with the time and space around the stoned detective to manipulate the feeling that the film is expelling. Just look at this scene where they've been pulled over and Doc suddenly switches from the passenger seat to the driver's seat. It's completely intentional and just adds another layer of absurdity to the scene. And the film even leaves us with an open question of whether or not the film's narrator was even a real person or just a result of Doc's copious drug use. Yet Inherent Vice still has the same level of meticulousness that Magnolia had, but whilst Inherent Vice is crafted to feel free and the camera is more of a human observer in this sense, Magnolia is a lot more locked down and the camera feels a lot like we're watching through the eyes of a deity. And the shots are a lot more precisely composed, whilst Inherent Vice embraces the free form of the camera and lets it kind of wander around the characters. And this makes perfect sense when you consider the religious themes in Magnolia and the spiritual themes in Inherent Vice. Magnolia connects all of its characters through coincidence and chance, as well as this generational trauma, and the film all but states a god exists within the realms of the film, when the film enacts Exodus 8:2 as each character is reaching the apex of their emotional reckonings by raining down frogs. And looking back at the film, you can probably pick up on the references to this Bible passage throughout the runtime. Officer Jim's journey of redemption sees him grapple with the guilt of past actions and seeking forgiveness, as well as this generational trauma being very present throughout the majority of characters. There's also often a biblical cadence to the dialogue in the film as well.
And the book says we may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. And no, it is not dangerous to confuse children with angels.
Whilst Magnolia, a film in PTA's early outputs, was heavy in its religious themes, Inherent Vice, in his later works, takes a much more spiritual approach. Inherent Vice is set in 1970s LA, a time where experimentation with marijuana and psychedelic drugs such as LSD was high, but the hippie culture shifted from being associated with peace to being associated with fear and violence after the Manson murders. The film's protagonist, Doc, is never not high during the film's runtime. However, the drugs are not purely recreational for Doc, but fuel his spiritual journey within his alternate lifestyle and serves him as a tool to navigate through this surreal world. And this also brings the audience along a spiritual journey too, as Inherent Vice is one of those films that asks us to feel rather than to think with its dreamlike and hallucinatory qualities. There are scenes where the film feels reminiscent of Malik's visually poetic style. Shasta Fay, Doc's missing ex-girlfriend, and Sortilege, the film's narrator, both have these mysterious auras that surround them. Shasta kind of appears at random unexpectedly at the beginning of the film and towards the end, and Sortilege is this clairvoyant presence that acts as a spiritual guide as the narrator of the film, who also seems to know things about the events of the story and the characters that they don't even know about themselves. The Ouija board that they play is also another spiritual tool that they use to try and help them navigate this world. I find it really fascinating that from Magnolia to Inherent Vice, somewhere along the way, PTA became less focused on religion and more interested in a character's own spiritual journey. And that's not to say he dropped religious themes, because they're still very prominent in his work. Even in Inherent Vice, there's this religious imagery present, like in this scene where he cleverly blocks the characters to kind of recreate the Last Supper. In Magnolia, many things link the characters together, whether that be religion, generational trauma, and other repressed emotions, chance or coincidence, or the divine intervention of the frogs falling from the sky. But Inherent Vice is much more about an individual and the navigation of the world and the people around him. And I think it not only speaks to PTA's skill as a filmmaker, but to his love of people and their imperfections, that he's just as great as he is at tackling many different characters as he is just tackling the one or the few. Magnolia and Inherent Vice break PTA's usual pattern of two characters meeting for the first time by chance, which kicks off the film's narrative. The films still have traces of this trend, but in Magnolia, PTA is viewing every character's story as one story on this grand scale of coincidence. Claudia and Officer Jim's story becomes tangled by meeting for the first time, but that doesn't set off the film's narrative as a whole, but it does hugely enhance their own individual ones. Magnolia also spends time building up a core reunion to enhance the emotional reckoning of all the characters in the film, where Frank and Earl, after years of estrangement, meet again as Earl is about to die. And when they do reunite, that almost brings upon this divine intervention that kicks off the film's climax. Inherent Vice is at its core about the relationship of Doc and Shasta Fay, which does set off the film's narrative, but unlike in other PTA projects, these characters don't come to meet by chance. Instead, there's this reunion of the two in the beginning as Shasta Fay knowingly seeks out Doc for help, and she mysteriously returns back to Doc towards the end too. And the narrative of the film itself doesn't follow along the characters' relationship. Instead, the layers of this relationship are gradually peeled back without a pivotal moment of that relationship driving the narrative forward. Magnolia and Inherent Vice are ultimately just the two PTA films that connect with me the most on a personal level, but I do think there is something very interesting in how, when I look deeper, they are probably the two most different films in Paul Thomas Anderson's body of work. And I'm also not saying they're necessarily his best films, because that's not for me to say. The guy has an immaculate body of masterpieces to his name, but I do think that these are the two films in his filmography that stray the furthest from his usual formula, but are also two films that couldn't be more different from each other, and yet they still radiate a style and feeling that can only be found in one of PTA's films. But again, thank you for listening to me waffle a little bit about my two favourite Paul Thomas Anderson films. And I hope you enjoyed the video today, and if you did, please do consider subscribing and leaving a like. That would be a huge help, but until next time, I'll see you later.